Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for patiently waiting. Uh, Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the session on AI for All, Bridging the Global AI Divide. AI can significantly assist economies fast-tracking their progress on sustainable development goals. It can help countries further stimulate their economic and social growth to advance global development. However, inequitable sharing of benefits accruing from AI innovations is a major roadblock that Global South countries are yet to overcome. Despite the critical contribution of Global South economies in the AI value chain, for instance, data sets and annotators, their access to economic benefits from AI development and adoption remains minimal. Moreover, to realize the potential benefits of AI for underserved populations, it is imperative to address and mitigate the potential risks around AI. While several international organizations have issued guidelines and ethical frameworks to promote the trustworthy use of AI, it is worth noting that they have largely been shaped by the thinking of the Global South. The Global North. In this context, the concerns specific to the Global South have received only marginal attention or have been subsumed within a framework of challenges and issues prevalent in the Global North. This session seeks to highlight potential opportunities and challenges of leveraging AI to drive potential change and development in the Global South. This session is particularly significant as it is aligned to India's priorities proposed within the GPI. We have an esteemed set of panelists from multilateral organizations, industry, governments, who will be sharing their insights on how we can collectively align efforts and build a robust and equitable future for the AI innovation ecosystem. May I first request Mr. Shri Secretary, Shri S. Krishnan, Secretary MeitY, to join us on the stage to deliver his keynote address. S. Krishnan, sir, is the Secretary of MeitY. He has earlier served as the Additional Chief Secretary, Industries, Investment, Promotion, and Commerce Department, Government of Tamil Nadu during March 2020 to August 2023. Welcome, sir. You're welcome on the podium to deliver your remarks.
Good afternoon. As we start the final afternoon's events of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence here in Bharat Mandapam in New Delhi, I think we've had a very, very successful GPI summit so far, and it illustrates what this particular session really holds for us, which is on bridging the global AI divide. Literally, the mission of GPI and all that was being attempted through this particular summit, where India assumes presidentship of GPI for a year for 2024, is focused really on bridging this global divide. It gives me great pleasure today that we have the Honorable Neema Lugangira, Member of Parliament from Tanzania, and of course, my old friend, His Excellency Alex Ellis, the High Commissioner of the United Kingdom here to India, Ms. Sneha Revanur, Founder President of ENCODE Justice, Dr. Kalika Bali, Principal Researcher of Microsoft, Dr. Alison Gilwald, Executive Director, Research, ICT Africa, and of course, Mr. Anirudh Suri, who are here for this session. Quite honestly, the mission that India has looked at for itself is to ensure that in the digital space, global digital goods, global digital public infrastructure is made available and democratized on a much bigger scale. The Honorable Prime Minister, when he spoke at the inaugural ceremony, emphasized this point repeatedly. There were a number of occasions when he came back to this point that the intention is to really democratize and the intention is to really bridge this global divide. In a number of ways, the digital revolution, which is finally catching steam, possibly in its third decade currently, and particularly with artificial intelligence and the other attendant technologies that go with it. I mean, in a sense, when you look at IoT, or when you look at machine learning, or when you look at many other applications of what is part of the digital revolution today, are all linked in some form or the other with artificial intelligence. When people make presentations, when they talk about how AI has been applied, you always find that it's not in isolation, but it's in association with some other digital technologies which are getting adopted, in which data is getting collected, and then it's a question of how you use the data better to see better outcomes. In that sense, the potential that artificial intelligence has today has been compared to what the Industrial Revolution did for the world in the late 19th century. So when you look back on history and when you look back on how life went before, and with the Industrial Revolution, what happened with the United Kingdom at that point, what happened with Great Britain in terms of how far ahead they went to the rest of the world. And then, as an outcome of all of those historic developments, we saw the two great wars, which then saw an international world order coming together. Historically, when you look back, it took that duration of time. We had to wage war before we could actually find a way of doing business, talking to each other on a multilateral basis, on a global basis. And the process thereafter has been one of progressively global institutions themselves getting democratized, global institutions themselves being formed on a more equitable basis. I would not say that the race has been won all the way. I would not say that all the changes that need to happen have as yet happened. There is unfinished business on that front, but you can see that as a process. Now, the advantage we have today is that presumably we would have learned from this history. And presumably we can start on a better footing in terms of having a more democratized setup, having a more equitable way in which we approach this issue. Clearly, if there is a huge economic opportunity out of the use of artificial intelligence, and if there is inequity in the way that the preconditions for its application are distributed across the world, it has the potential to accentuate the inequalities and has the potential to accentuate the disequilibrium. Whether you talk about compute power, whether you talk about skill, whether you talk about the data availability, all of these are critical to the way AI can come together for the world. And today we find that there is inequity in the distribution of some of this and inequality in the distribution of some of this. Likewise, if you allow a free play of this without any coordinated action at the global level, then it could result in a huge number of haves and have-nots and accentuate the kind of economic and other pressures that we have globally. I mean, this is one reality I think we need to be aware of. Fortunately, we have global institutions today. There were hardly any global institutions in 1914 when the First World War broke out. And whatever global institution was formed post the Second World War hardly worked when the Second World War broke out. But the lasting institutions, lasting global institutions were really created post-1945, whether it's the United Nations or the Bretton Woods Twins or any of those institutions, and what they have spawned later. So we need to look at even GPAI as a successor in that line, as an institution that has come in at the right time, even at a stage when the potential of this technology is becoming apparent, to see how we can work together to make sure that it delivers for everybody. And that was the theme that in the G20 summit as well, the New Delhi Leaders Declaration, this point was made, saying responsible AI for all was the theme with which G20 finished off. So there are two parts to this. One part to this, we don't allow artificial intelligence to take over in a way that affects everybody across the world. and we make sure that artificial intelligence works for everybody. And those are the two limbs which I think as responsible societies, as responsible nations, countries of the world need to get together to actually work on. And GPI, interestingly enough, is a modern organization which includes not just national players, but also includes multiple stakeholders, includes experts, includes a range of other institutions who understand what the potential of the technology is and who can sit there and advise policymakers and others as to how exactly, in what direction this needs to push. I'm emphasizing this institutional mechanism simply because I think many people have also internationally recognized that we are at a day and stage where, unlike what happened when the internet took over the world or when the first wave of digitalization took place in the 1990s, when in the name of, everyone felt that everyone didn't know much about it, and everyone felt that regulating it probably didn't even feel the need for regulation. Even before we realized it, it took over the world. It has resulted in significant benefits, undoubtedly, but it has resulted in certain issues. And we are all aware of what the issues are. Issues are being countered across the globe. Big tech is suddenly a name as much as big oil was a name 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And these are concerns. Therefore, today, to democratize this entire ecosystem is an opportunity that we have before us simply because we have the institutional mechanisms in place. We have the hindsight of all that has gone in the past and the lessons that we need to learn from that, and in the way that the potential this holds. Having said that, I would like to again emphasize that at least as far as India is concerned, the primary emphasis is on trying to harness the potential of AI for good. And if we are able to harness the potential of AI for good in terms of innovation, then make sure that it is made available on a democratized basis to as many people as possible across the world. India has certain definite advantages in this space. It has the advantage of talent in terms of the skill preparedness is rated as the highest in the world. It has the advantage of data, simply being the most populous country in the world, and with many applications today working in an electronic environment. There's huge volumes of data which are simply available, which can be used to train any large language model. Where we lack currently is in AI compute power, which needs to be created, and where, again, there is a dependence on large entities, corporates and others, which needs to be made available to a larger group of people. And there is the need to develop more models which are more suited to the global south and to all other countries compared to the models which have already been created, which are based on limited databases and therefore have their inherent biases. This being the case, what India has the potential to do and what India has the potential to offer to the world is the possibility of developing AI models, developing AI applications which can be used across the world, especially in the global south. Whether it is in the area of agriculture, whether it is in the area of healthcare, whether it's in the area of education, whether it's in the area of translation of languages. That's a big challenge for India itself. We have to make ourselves understood across the country. And if there is a way of quickly translating, and that is precisely the effort which is going on currently with Bhashini and other efforts, all of this will enable us to offer digital public goods on a basis which is equitable and accessible to everybody in the world. Part of it is the story of how DPI's digital public infrastructure has developed in India itself. It's developed out of this a public spiritedness on the part of the private sector to want to contribute to this, and the efforts of the government to encourage it and support it so that it grows in scale and is applicable across the country. Whether you take the identity project, Aadhaar, or whether you take the payments project of NPCI, or you take the health project which is going on currently, there are a range of other projects which have been developed in this fashion. Some of them are also now developing in the public sector itself, like the Gati Shakti project, which is being spoken of now in terms of how infrastructure can be located. Now, all of this uses the power of both information technology and increasingly the power of artificial intelligence in each of these applications is being clubbed and linked in order to create more and more powerful projects which can support what needs to happen in terms of better delivery of public services. While that is on the one side about delivery of public services, equally, use of these kind of tools by industry can greatly enhance productivity and greatly contribute to economic growth. And the last thing which we need to do at this point clearly is to make sure that we have skills and we have human resources which are trained so that not only are they able to apply all these methods, but at the same time ensure that they don't lose their jobs to artificial intelligence. So I think it's as much a defensive strategy as it is an offensive strategy. So I think this is something that India can certainly contribute across the globe. The Honorable Prime Minister recently announced the implementation of a social impact fund to support the spread of DPIs across the world. Clearly, this is an effort where many countries need to come together. Multilateral institutions and other aid agencies across the world need to come together to make sure that countries in the global south where these resource endowments are not available are provided with this support. And again, the wheel need not be reinvented in every country. Where a DPI has already been developed in one country, it can be easily adopted in another country. The same will go for applications of artificial intelligence which can be applied across different countries. So clearly this is a model which we can suggest to the world and which through this year of GPI's presidency, India's GPI's presidency is something that we will push to ensure that it is something which India can give back to the world and make sure that in the area of artificial intelligence, we clearly enable more and more countries to leapfrog. There is evidence in our favor. I go back to history. I was trained as a historian. So when you look at, in the digital space or in the adoption of mobile technology, mobile communications, and even mobile banking, India has managed to leapfrog across many countries. I lived in the United States for about 4 or 5 years, and when I came back to India, when you discovered how much cheaper mobile services are and how much easier to use they are, you clearly know that you've come of age. So there's no reason why countries in the global south cannot have the best possible resources to work with and why that cannot happen. And I really fully expect that this global divide is something that we can certainly bridge in the days to come. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't exceeded my time. You didn't put down my time there, so it's a little difficult to see. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for an inspiring address on learning from history to build an equitable and fairer AI innovation ecosystem, and also highlighting India's vision of democratizing AI resources. Now I invite Honorable Neema Lugangira on the stage to deliver her keynote remarks. She's a member of parliament in Tanzania. As a parliamentarian, her personal prioritized agendas include food and nutrition security, digital development, community health, gender equality in politics, and NGO sector development in Tanzania and across Africa. I'll give the stage to her to deliver her keynote remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neema Lugangira, Member of Parliament from Tanzania, and I'm very honored to be here Permanent Secretary, High Commissioner, everybody on the panel. I'm very happy to be here, and I bring to you greetings from Tanzania, from Her Excellency President Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, and my speaker, Honorable Dr. Tulia Ackson, are both sending you greetings. I would like to start off by saying that, as we all know, just in the last 2 months, the Global North has been making extreme progress in artificial intelligence, especially in AI governance, starting from October 2023, when we saw President Biden signing the executive order on putting together safety AI measures. And then in November, the UK Prime Minister hosted the AI UK Summit. And then just a few days ago, 9th of December, we've seen that the EU AI Act is coming into effect. But with all of this being done, one thing that I would like all of you to ask yourselves as I'm continuing with my keynote is, how is the voice of the Global South being represented in these discussions? How did the EU members of parliament engage members of parliament from the Global South to get our opinions or our consultation? How many countries from the Global South were at the AI UK Summit, etc., etc.? So how then is the global voice being represented in all of these Global North interventions? Similarly, GPAI, the Global Partnership of Artificial Intelligence, I think it was launched somewhere 2020, we're now at 2023, but even 3 years later in Africa, it's only Senegal who is a member of GPAI. So again, that goes to show that we have a lot of work to do in making sure that when it comes to artificial intelligence, we're inclusive, and by being inclusive, we need to get more and more countries from the Global South to be represented. Third issue I would like to raise is that we all know artificial intelligence highly depends on data sets. And this means that data governance, data justice, data protection is crucial. Now, a lot of countries in Africa have data protection acts. I think we're about 38 countries or so. Through the African Union, we had the Malabo Declaration that also had a component of data protection, but that took almost 8 years to reach ratification of only 15 countries to ratify. Now the question is, with all of our countries, including Tanzania, we have a Data Protection Act. How is that act aligned to the issues of AI governance? What are the gaps in between? And if there are gaps, what then can such global AI movements do to make sure that our data protection acts, our data governance acts are taking into account issues of artificial intelligence? Because without doing so, then we remain to put the Global South at the risk of data exploitation, data monetization. Most of us in the Global South don't own where the data is being stored. And whenever we in our countries or our governments want to have access to that data that was extracted from our countries, our governments have to pay for that data. Is that fair? Is that right? Is that governance? Those are the things that we need to be discussing, and we need to have those tough discussions, real, authentic discussions, if at all we want to have the true AI governance framework. Of course, there are potentials of artificial intelligence in the health sector, agriculture sector, food security, water, education. But even with these potentials, if I take, for example, education, there's ChatGPT. How is a teacher, I come from a peripheral region, Kagera. It borders Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. How is a teacher in Kagera region going to know that their student submitted an essay which they used using ChatGPT? How is a teacher in the peripheral region going to know that? So this brings another component that, much as it has a huge positive potential in education, we also need to make sure we capacitate our teachers, capacitate our health workers, so that they can also know. It should be, how are they going to know? Is this original work, or is it AI generated, etc.? Again, a few other risks: democracy, accountability. Myself being a member of parliament, being a politician, there's a huge risk of artificial intelligence on us, which intensifies online abuse that we're already experiencing as women leaders, but through artificial intelligence, this online abuse is even becoming worse, because now someone can take your voice, put your voice on someone else's image, make it seem you're somewhere where you are not. And how do you then claim that it's not you when it looks exactly like you, it sounds like you? A few months ago, we saw a video clip that trended all over social media showing that the Zambian president had announced that he's only going to have one term in office, only to find out that it was not true. It was AI generated. But the confusion and the chaos that it had caused was enormous. So those are some of the risks with AI, including the gender bias. Because I said earlier, AI depends on data. Already, most of the existing data is gender bias. So this means that even AI would be gender bias. What are we doing to address the issue of gender bias? So my call to action. Number one, we need capacity building of artificial intelligence to governments, capacity building of artificial intelligence to policymakers, teachers, healthcare workers, and not forgetting peripheral regions as well. Number two, if at all we want to bridge the existing AI gaps, we need to look at the issue of digital skills. We need to look at the issues of infrastructure. We need to look at the issues of cost of devices, cost of connectivity, etc. Number three, we need a global minimum acceptable standard for artificial intelligence. And I cannot emphasize this enough. Why am I saying this? The EU AI Act requires businesses that are going to operate in the EU to adhere to a certain behavior. But when the same businesses which are registered in the EU or are registered in the UK or US or Canada come to operate in Tanzania, they can behave anyhow they want because we don't have a robust act or robust legislative framework as these countries. Now, is that being ethical on the global north side? I think there should be a way in which the laws that are created on the global north can instill a minimum acceptable behavior of their companies, irregardless of where they operate. And this has been done in other sectors, so why can it not be done in the AI sector? So I cannot emphasize enough that as my third call to action, that we need a global minimum acceptable standard for AI, so that AI companies, irrespective of where they are, they should adhere to a minimum standard that is in the EU Act or the US, UK, Canada, etc. Number four, AI governance frameworks is taking a multi-sectoral approach, which is very good and very commendable. Unfortunately, there is one key stakeholder who is almost always forgotten. Whenever there is a multi-stakeholder group, there is one key stakeholder who is always forgotten. Can you guess who? Members of Parliament are always forgotten. Because we tend to look at CSOs, academia, government, but we forget that members of Parliament are a different arm of government. And it is critical to make sure that in our multi-stakeholder approaches, we also engage and include and capacitate members of Parliament, because it is us, members of Parliament, who have, one, the mandate to create the laws, legislation, regulatory environment that can either be detrimental or be positive for the AI sector. But two, we're the ones who can hold our governments accountable and all the other stakeholders accountable to that effect. So I would like to, as my fourth call to action, to appeal to all of you to making sure that whenever we are having multi-stakeholder approaches, let us ensure that members of Parliament are also part of that process. Fifth and the final call to action is that, as we all know, the AI is developing faster than we can catch on. And oftentimes on global forums of artificial intelligence, the voices and the representation of people from the global south is usually missing. And the biggest challenge why it's missing is not that we are not there, it's not that we do not have enough to contribute, or it's not that we do not have ideas, but the biggest challenge is usually the travel support. How can we attend these global AI forums? And I'm very grateful that in the room there's Mama Mei Ling. Please stand up so they can see you. Earlier this year in March, I have an NGO called Omuka Hub, and we had won a WSIS award for the work that we're doing on ICT with the elderly. But I had nowhere to attend. And she volunteered to cover my travel support, and I was able to go to Geneva through her support. So, but why did she have to do it? Because oftentimes when we organize for such events, we forget that there are key stakeholders who need travel support. We provide travel support for civil society, but we forget travel support for members of parliament. So that was my final fifth call to action. And in line with that, I would like to sincerely express my gratitude to you, Honorable Secretary, from the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology of India, for seeing the value of making sure that the GPAI Summit in India is going to be inclusive and including the voices of us as parliamentarians, and I'm here on behalf of the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance, which is a network which is bringing together members of parliament from Africa. Thank you so much for considering us and ensuring that I'm able to stand here today and present to you all our worries and our guidance and what is our call to action. So once again, thank you very much to the government of India for your support. Thank you. So I wish to conclude by saying that, and to reaffirm that in order to achieve global artificial intelligence governance, we must shift from being global north exclusive and become global south inclusive. Allow me to repeat. I wish to conclude by reaffirming that in order to achieve global artificial intelligence governance, we must shift from being global north exclusive to become global north inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for highlighting the need of representation of Global South in identifying and classifying risks from AI systems. Now, in the interest of time, while we have an esteemed set of panelists who have a lot of accolades under their wings, in the interest of time, I'm just going to give them a brief introduction, just so that our audience joining us in person and virtually are aware of their brief accolades. Mr. Anirudh Suri is the founding partner of India Internet Fund. Dr. Kalika Bali is a researcher at the Microsoft Research India division, working in the areas of machine learning, natural language systems, and applications, as well as technology for emerging markets. His Excellency Alex Ellis has been appointed as the British High Commissioner to the Republic of India. Ms. Neha Revanur is the founder and the president of Encode Justice, a youth-led AI-focused civil society group. Dr. Alison Gilwald is the executive director of Research ICT Africa. We're looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Great. Can you all hear us fine? Perfect. So I think I couldn't be more excited to have such a great set of panelists to follow up, I think, on the two great keynote addresses that I think we've just had the opportunity to listen to. It's going to be a hard act for us, so I'm glad that we have a great group, and I think as the Honorable Nima Luvungira mentioned, thankfully on this panel we do have an MP represented. I think we have research represented, we have diplomats represented, we of course have bureaucrats represented, we have non-profit leaders represented. So I must say, and I can say, okay, maybe from my perspective, even folks from the space of entrepreneurship, venture capital, think tanks represented. And I think that I'll just take a couple of seconds to emphasize how important it is to have conversations around AI be done in groups that are well represented. I think the point that you also made. And I think that's going to be essential going forward. So I'm glad we have that to some extent covered, and I'm sure we are missing some groups still, but I think it's a great start. So let me give you all in the audience a brief overview how we are going to structure this about 65 to 70 minutes. We're going to talk about 5 main themes, time permitting. The first one that we're going to look at is how AI can serve as an opportunity for developing countries, economically and otherwise, societally. We're going to look at the risks that come with adopting AI in the Global South. We're going to look at how countries in the Global South can start to develop and enable environments and ecosystems for safe and inclusive adoption of AI. And I'll add not just adoption of AI, but also hopefully the fourth point being how do we enable co-creation of AI technologies, applications, etc. in the global south. And then finally, the fifth theme we'll try and touch upon is what role India can play in being a key player in bridging this divide between the global south and the global north on AI in particular, right? So those are the broad 5 themes we'll try and capture. Instead of going speaker by speaker to get remarks, I'm going to go theme by theme and bring in speakers into each of the questions for each theme. So let me get started. The first piece that I mentioned, the first theme that we want to go through is how can AI serve as an opportunity for optimism, for growth, inclusiveness in developing nations. I think our Secretary of METI very nicely set up the historical context. This is a moment that comes once in a few centuries where you have technology, especially general purpose technologies like AI that come up that can really shape the economic divergence between nations, economic divergence within nations, and hence the opportunity must be looked at in a way that can be captured broadly by a broad set of groups across the world and not just a few, let's say, companies or firms sitting in just 1 or 2 geographies in the world. So let me start with that opportunity question, right? The AI stack, as it's being talked about, right, is I think a good framework to start talking about the opportunity as well. The AI stack, for many of you who might not be familiar with that, again, Mr. Krishnan laid that out also in many ways, starts from maybe the infrastructure layer, what is today being built as large language models, on the research that underlies a lot of those large language models that ultimately serve as the foundation for applications to be built. There's the hardware element here, which is the GPUs, etc., that underlie a lot of the research and computation required to build these models and then eventually those applications. Of course, you need talent, and talent, not just general talent. In the case of AI, you need top-tier research talent. You need, of course, software developers to build the applications, enterprise or otherwise. And of course, you need research in any country in order to build cutting-edge innovation that can then be leveraged by applications. You need capital. This is going to be a high-stakes capital game as well, right? Let's be very clear that this, when you require a lot of GPUs to build your compute infrastructure, when you need great research talent, when you need startups to have long times to develop their models, right? This requires a lot of capital. And of course, capital is also not distributed equally around the world between the global south and global north. And then, of course, you need enabling strategies and policies. So let me start on that point. Having said that context, I want to bring all our panelists in to first talk about where do you see this divide being the most acute between the global south and the global north on any of those dimensions of the AI stack. And I'll start with you, Dr. Bali, Kalika. On where do you see that divide being the most acute?
Hello? Yeah. So I think we have great potential in all the areas that you mentioned. I think the problem lies in the actualization of that potential. So we have no dearth of high quality researchers who are completely capable of coming up with any of these technologies, any of these models, etc. Here in India. Maybe we need some kind of infrastructural support, some kind of resource support for them to do this in a way that benefits the entire world, not just India. We also probably, from a research perspective, need our researchers to be more exposed to not just the aspirational desires of, not just the needs of the population, different population, but also the aspirational desires of the population. So I think what usually happens a lot is, because India is a country of great diversity, the very different needs and desires are in different parts of the country, and somehow technologists can fall into the trap of being in these ivory towers where they do not realize, what somebody say in Arunachal Pradesh or somebody in heartland of Madhya Pradesh wants, needs, or desires. So I think that is a big thing that we need.
Great. So enabling infrastructure, and of course a focus on the actual needs of the population. Ambassador Ellis, if I can bring you in. Now, of course, UK had a summit that you guys recently hosted on AI, which actually brought a lot of countries together. But then as Member of Parliament Lugungira also mentioned, maybe not as inclusive from the Global South's perspective. But where do you see these divides from the standpoint of being a diplomat sitting in India, but of course the UK being part of the Global North? Where do you see the divides being acute, and how do you see those divides getting bridged?
Thanks very much. I used to be a teacher. I used to teach a double lesson on Thursday afternoons about this time. And this was not always the highest energy time for my 16-year-old students, so I'm very impressed. I'll be checking at the back about alertness. There was one boy who used to try and climb out the window during the course of the double lesson, see if he could climb back in without me noticing. There are no windows in this room, I'm afraid. Thank you for the chance to participate in the panel, and thank you for the speeches as well. I've really set the framework very well. So quickly, I was looking through the list of signatories of the Bletchley Park Declaration. Remember, the UK summit was really about frontier AI and the risks of frontier AI. A lot of AI is being used very commonly already, as you know better than me. And I was kind of cheered when I looked through the list of countries, because it's pretty much every continent of the world is represented. It includes China and the United States. There are not many things where you could manage to have both those countries. It has India, it has Nigeria, it has the Philippines, it has Rwanda, it has Brazil. So I could go on. And it's very interesting listening to the secretary, because the truth is, in 1945, some of the most important countries of the world did not exist as independent countries. The two countries sitting to my left did not incredibly exist as independent countries at that time. It's a big change. So we're going into a world where I think there is a greater spread of voice than there was even 30 years ago. So that is, I say you have more hope actually now than 30 years ago of wider voice. And India matters in that, because India both has a strong voice, but also has different interests and drivers to some of the global north. And I think that makes it it's very important. India has to be in everything now, which is new. And I think the world is better for that. So where are the other risks that lie? Sorry, just to finish off, the reason why we're hosting that summit is, one, because we think that you can't leave this alone to the private sector. I think you were saying that in your speech. You can't just leave it to the private sector to do this stuff anymore. You need some state role. And also, unashamedly, I think our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak would say the UK's bet is in the economy of the future. Life sciences, AI, that kind of stuff. And that's why we think it's so important to address these issues and to get the whole world addressing them. Where are the risks? I think that there's an issue around capability, state capability. Because to do this properly, you need not necessarily legislation, but you need regulation. And to get good regulators on something as complex as AI, that is really hard. So having states which have the capacity to do this. India, again, is an unusual country. A GDP per head of roughly $2,500 in market prices, higher in PPP, but at the same time a very capable state in terms of, and I'm not just trying to flatter the secretary, although that's always wise to do that, but actually it's a very capable state. It is capable of doing that kind of thing, but it's going to be tough for all countries. I think voice, I'm actually a bit less worried about, because you have extremely articulate parliamentarians, as we've just heard, and other leaders. If you listen to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, talk about climate change, you know there's some powerful voices which are being heard about that. I think that capital and research will be a big issue. Essentially, 4 of the top 10 universities of the world are in my country. Those universities, they're out there to try and get the talent of the world to come to those universities, and you can't blame them for that. You have brilliant researchers in India. They're spread all over the world. So there's something around research, although I think that people accept now that research has to have its applicability way beyond the global north. If you're trying out, for example, some of the new pharma research, you're really looking at countries like India as part of that. So you've got to have capability, you've got to have voice, you've got to have research. Capital, I think, will be a big issue, because exactly the reasons you give. I mean, this is incredibly expensive stuff. To generate the computing power necessary, You either need huge scale, which India definitely does have, and you need capital as well. And with the data sets, I also agree, include some bias. So to finish off, the good news is on every single one of those issues, we're just launching now an AI and development plan, and it's exactly to address exactly those issues. How do you increase state capability in the poorest countries in the world? How do you ensure research? How do you get language, which would be a huge issue in AI, into enough of the different kinds of languages into AI to reduce the biases? So it's going to be a fundamental part of development. We've just issued a development strategy. Interestingly, there's a digital development strategy coming as well. So I like to think the UK is doing that. The good news is, there's bad news and good news about the state of the world. One, it is a much more divided world than it was 30 years ago, and that makes it harder to do things at a global level. No doubt about that, yeah? And that's why I think the Prime Minister judging, we need to have China and the United States and other countries in the same room on this. But it's much more divided, but the voices of different parts of the world are much louder than they were 30 years ago, I think. And so I think you have a much better chance on something new of reducing some of those imbalances than on some of the old issues. Thank you.
Secretary Shri Krishan, if I can bring you...
I think you should just go and give them a chance.
Fine, so we'll start from there and I'll come back to the two of you. Sneha, if I can come to you next, right? We were just talking before we came up here that a lot of your work is focused on youth. But the question that I had broadly laid out, I think we'll cover some of that. But from your perspective as well, working so closely with youth to make sure their voice is being heard as AI develops, applications develop, where do you see some of the biggest gaps on this global south, global versus global north divide?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's really important to really emphasize youth participation because as we all know, young people are the next generation of workers and consumers, and we really are the ones driving this digital transformation. And so I think that in the context of discussing this global north and global south divide, we really need to emphasize digital skills training, building digital literacy, and building K through 12 curricula to really emphasize digital citizenship. I think that, for example, there's one amazing country that has created a blueprint here, and that's Kenya, that has actually created an astonishing digital literacy blueprint through its government to actually support the integration of that curriculum at the K through 12 level. And I think that other countries will need to follow suit in terms of really bringing that to young people. And so I think that's definitely one key point, just really making that a core part of educational curricula around the world. I also think that, with the demands of generative AI and the fact that it's already transforming labor and the workforce all over the world, it's going to require upskilling for the next generation of workers. It's going to require reinvesting in deeply human skills like critical thinking and creativity that can't be as easily automated. And I think that all of that will start with the global south. And I think another key point of the conversation is that, I think you mentioned this as well in your opening remarks, but a lot of the data sets that are being trained, are actually requiring labor that is extracted from and outsourced to the global south. And I think that there really needs to be some sort of framework for addressing that, for making sure that workers in the global south are fairly compensated for the work that they're doing to contribute to the training of these models. And I think that that's also a crucial part of the conversation where I'm seeing these gaps show up. So I think some sort of framework to really redress that and to ensure that workers in the global south are fairly compensated for their contributions to these models, because right now they kind of are silently powering and doing the lion's share of the work behind these advanced models that we're hearing about from the global north. So I think that's also one thing to consider.
Great, thanks so much, Sneha, for highlighting some of those aspects. Dr. Gilwell, Alison, if I can bring you in. You work at ICT Africa. And of course, we've spoken a little bit right now about the need for those voices to be heard more. So if I can ask you specifically, now from the perspective of where you sit, right? What are some of the biggest dimensions on which you see this divide being the most acute?
Thank you so much for that. I think when you asked the question about, what are the opportunities, and I think everybody kind of got back to the enabling frameworks, the underlying foundational infrastructures we need and that sort of thing. So I guess, if we answer some of those questions about what we need to do, then we might be optimistic. And I think there are lots of windows of opportunity at the moment that can make us quite optimistic. I think these developments we've had around regulating, from US to the UK to the European Union are important steps in dealing with some of the uneven distribution of harms that are associated with these data-driven technologies. But as Honourable Member Nina has referred to, these are blueprints or whatever that come from the north, from a very different context that we're dealing with in the global south. And so I think it's a very important that in the work that we've been doing in GPI, I'm in the expert group on data governance, we've had a work stream over 2 years on data justice, which has been trying to address the fact that even if you've got these human rights framed frameworks that we've got with responsible AI and good AI, even if you've got these ethics by design frameworks that we're seeing coming out of the engineering world and the developers world, these don't necessarily produce just outcomes if you don't have the enabling environment for people to exercise those rights, to be aware of their rights, to actually fundamentally to be included. And that's why I think we're increasingly speaking about digital inequality, not the digital divide, because it's not just about inclusion, it's about equity. We see at the moment one of the biggest, I would say, research policy problems we face is this digital inequality paradox, that as we connecting more and more people, as more people are being exposed to these advanced technologies, we're actually amplifying inequality without the kind of regulation that we need to see. And this is no longer just old broadband, people who've got voice or not got voice, got internet or not got internet. This is about in general purpose technology of the kind we haven't seen before, that is immediately by not even being able to show up in the data that's being used for these massive decisions that are being made on multiple levels by big tech platforms, or being seen in the data that's being used in your BioID system, because the BioID is developed in a country that doesn't take account of your skin color or whatever it is. So these are really sort of fundamental issues that we have to get right if we are not going to be continuing to have these same conversations on digital divide, digital inequality, as we get these technological evolutions that are out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if I, Ms. Lugungira, if I can bring you in, you obviously made, I think, lots and lots of very pertinent points about where this divide is stuck, right? Ranging from the fact that voices maybe are still not as representative in global organizations, from the fact that countries are still not obviously have equal access to some of the research, some of the models, some of the applications. But let me flip that and ask you for more of a solution now. So as you look at all of these divides from your perspective, as you look at all of these inequities from your perspective, what are some of the ways in which either at a regional level, let's say within Africa, or at a slightly bigger level, let's say the global south, how can we encourage more regional and cooperation amongst the global south countries, that you feel like, what are 3 or 4 ways in which you feel these countries can come together and collaborate, whether through governments, whether through non-profits, whether through research institutions, that can help to start to bridge that divide or those sets of divides? Because one can't expect the global north to, I think, suddenly say, oh, listen, by the way, we didn't realize that there were all these inequities. Let me just now come and fix this. That's not, I think, a reasonable expectation. So I do think that the global south will have to figure out ways for collaboration amongst global south countries as well. So give us some of your thoughts on how that kind of collaboration can be encouraged.
Thank you. I think what I can...
And I'm just going to move in the middle so that we don't have this glaring gap between talking about bridging divides.
So let's bridge the divides
Yes.
here already. Thank you very much for that question. I think what I can say, being mindful of time, is one, I'll start off with us as members of parliament. So number one, us as members of parliament in Africa realize that there is this gap, and realize that oftentimes maybe stakeholders may not know how best to engage members of parliament, or how to even engage and to bring about members of parliament from different countries at once. So one of the things that we've done as a solution is to set up the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance, which is bringing together members of parliament from Africa who are committed and aimed to contribute towards the digital development within Africa. So at least through APNIG, then stakeholders can know if we want to engage members of parliament in Africa interested in this topic, if they come to APNIG, they'll be able to get. So that's one side. Second is there are a number of...
Can I just interrupt? Is that something that you feel could be expanded from just the African MPs
Yeah, so
to
we're-
maybe the
we're-
Global South MPs and get more
So
of that network growing?
yeah, so that's what was my second point, in the sense that we've started that in Africa, but I feel one of the reasons why we're even trying to get the opportunities to participate in these different global discussions is to see how can we also have similar networks be established from other regional blocks, so that then we can engage and work together. That's number one. But number two, there are also parliamentary networks that at global level. So at global level, for example, we have the Unite Parliamentary Network on Global Health, which brings together members of parliament from across the world. And these are members of parliament who are interested and committed on the global health agenda. And as you know, artificial intelligence for health, there's a big piece and a huge potential, both positive as well as negative. So as members of parliament, under the Unite, we also have the opportunity to work together, but also because it's a global network, it gives us access to be able to engage with our counterparts on different parts. But then lastly, the third one is also through the African Union. I understand the African Union with the OECD will be working together to develop the Africa Union AI strategy. So that's another angle in which, as African parliamentarians, we can tap into that process, because one of the biggest gaps that currently exists is that whatever that is being agreed upon at global level or national level needs to be cascaded down at continental level, has to be cascaded down to national levels. And that is where the linkage of members of parliament comes in. But in all the processes, we for one highly recommend the multi-sector approach, because as members of parliament, we do not have, we're not the ones who do, for example, research. So in order for us to advocate and to advocate efficiently, it means we need evidence. So if we need evidence, it means we need to work closely together with research institutions, with NGOs, with academia, etc.
No, great. I think that's a great set of sort of very tangible things that I think can promote that Global South collaboration. Kalika, if I might bring you back in. You obviously work for Microsoft and work specifically in the research division. As I was mentioning about the AI stack earlier, the cutting edge research here in the field of AI is a critical part of the AI stack, but also is a part where maybe a massive amount of inequity exists. Data suggests that most of the cutting edge research, most of the top tier research talent is either sitting in or working for companies in the US, to some extent China, to some extent Europe and the UK. But largely global north, right? Which has two implications. One, the data that's being used in the research that many of the top tier research institutions and researchers are using tends to be skewed more towards the data that's emanating and being created maybe in the global north. Second, the applications that are then being looked at from a research standpoint also tend to be maybe skewed in that direction. So the question then that emanates for you is, how can stakeholders in the global south, in the absence of that top tier research talent, top tier research institutions sitting here, what kind of strategies can countries, firms, institutions in the global south adopt to ensure that there's more equitable representation, both in the kind of data being used, the languages and so on and so forth, so that both the research is more global south oriented and also the applications ultimately, so that AI can really be used for good for all?
So that's kind of a really difficult question, and I'm asked.
I like asking difficult questions.
And because from where I sit, I see a lot of talent, research talent around me. I see very good institutions completely capable, but what I do see is, I'm again harping on this, infrastructural support missing here. As far as
Can you highlight, so let's say 3 things in that infrastructural support that today is missing that needs to be developed?
compute is the largest thing that we require. These models cannot be built by somebody sitting at home working on a single PC. The second thing that we require are data from all languages, all communities, all kinds of tasks that are important for Global South, which are not necessarily the same as they are for Global North, right? And the third is an interconnectivity. So there is this tendency that, you know, if it is a government aided project, it's been the case in the past. Like if the government is supporting it, will go to academic kind of institutions, right? The support will go to them. The industry will do something on their own, the startups will do something on their own. And that's changing. And I think that needs to change at a very fast pace so that the things that are done in the academia, things that are done in the industry, things that are done by the startups are kind of interconnected to be able to leverage the work
Sure, that ecosystem needs to be
yeah,
talking to
so
each
the
other.
ecosystem needs to be, so those are my 3 top desires for this to work.
So let me drill deeper on the data point, right? So recently, I think we were discussing right before we got up here at the Carnegie Global Tech Summit recently, earlier in December. One of the things that came up when Mr. Nandan Nilekani, who's one of the founding architects of the India Stack and the UPI and Aadhaar story that has done wonders for India over the last decade, one of the things that he mentioned was that in the spirit of creating more inclusive LLMs, more inclusive applications and use cases on AI, we need to not rely on data just being that already exists on the internet. All the data that today exists on the internet, by and large, is being fed into the large language models that OpenAI and others are creating. And he said that to the extent that we want these LLMs to be more custom made for the Global South and India in particular, we need to have and build and crowdsource data from different languages that doesn't exist on the internet today, right? Both in terms of audio data, maybe voice data, etc. So tell me from your perspective, is that kind of crowdsourced data in multiple languages type strategy to bridge this data divide at least, right? That's feeding into LLMs. Is that kind of crowdsourced strategy from your perspective a good one? Or are there alternatives?
That's actually the prime way to bridge this data gap, because he's right. If you look at the internet, the number of languages represented on the internet are very minuscule, right? And it's predominantly Eurocentric, right? And the rest of the world has very little presence on the internet. And even if we look at Indian languages, except for Hindi, there isn't really enough data on the internet. And on top of that, it's not just that, even if you look at Hindi, the kind of data that's on the internet is not the kind of data that, you know, people use.
You
It's
mean
not,
all the Hindi entertainment?
yeah,
and
yeah, it's not an inclusive kind of representation of Hindi on the internet. So, and that data is already there in whatever models are being built. So we have to do some, right now crowdsourcing seems to be the most reasonable way and the quickest way to get the data out. One other thing could be to kind of digitize. We have a lot of print media, so digitizing that data for text data might be another way forward. But I think ultimately we have to crowdsource conversational speech, we have to crowdsource text from the users themselves, from the actual speakers of the language, and not, you know, something that's out there.
And of course, while a lot of, I think, and I'll expand this to beyond India, I think the Global South might be talking a lot on phones, even if they're not contributing content to the internet actively. And it seems like that kind of voice data, now of course that gets into whole privacy and security issues, but that kind of talking and audio content, if there could be figured out ways to tap that while maintaining privacy and security, I think that could become a rich source of data. But let me now move, Ambassador Ellis, to bring you into the conversation on the piece of talent and labor. So I'll share one data point here, and I want to look at talent in terms of both AI talent, but then also the impact of AI on the labor workforce, right? So from two different perspectives. On the talent piece first, there's a very interesting chart that shows the origin of top tier AI talent in the world, which countries is this top tier research talent emanating from, and where it's ending up working. And if you look at that, for example, India contributes about 8% when you look at top tier talent originating from a certain country. I don't know the exact number for the UK, but if you now look as opposed to the origin now where people are working, etc., it's a very lopsided picture. This top tier talent ends up working largely in the US, to some extent maybe in Europe and some China, but how do you, sitting in the UK, especially as you mentioned, right? So your Prime Minister, this particular summit, the goal is to focus the UK economy on these future emerging technologies, critical technologies. How do you think of this talent issue from a UK standpoint as well? Like, how do you start to make sure that you are not bereft of this top tier research talent? Because it seems like without that, you might not be able to really compete in this AI game. And then we'll come to the impact on the labor and workforce subsequently.
Sure. Well, we wanted to come to the United Kingdom. I don't hide that. I quote your foreign minister who says the principle of all relationships between nations is competition. There's a certain truth in that. And that talent is coming to the United Kingdom, actually, not so much in the kind of really big tech firms as in many United States, but actually as a place of research, UK is very, very attractive to people all over the world. And I'm delighted that we get such a large number of Indian students coming to the UK each year. And so you have to have very good institutions. They have to be able to see the consequences of their research. You have to spread it around the country. In our case, small country, but we like, it pops up in different ways. So I think that India will remain and increasingly be a generator of that talent. I've no doubt about that. That talent tends to move around the world. Some of that talent comes back to India, I should point out as well. One of the big changes of the last decade.
It's starting to come back a lot more.
Yeah, right. A lot more. And not least because of the commercial opportunities people see in India from... I think you can't disassociate it really from, I think it was a snare, as I'm talking about education, about what goes on in education. Because one of the problems I think you have in this world, and I think I can speak as somebody on the other side from the talent part of this, is ignorance. This is a very important point, parliamentarians, by the way. It's very hard to draft legislation and agree legislation on stuff you don't understand. And so how you get more people to understand what is going on and understand the basic principles of what you're trying to legislate on, the better, because we all know that what happens, if you are asked a question, there's some great sociology on this, if you're asked a question to which you just don't understand the issue, your answer is almost invariably no. And you react against what's being put to you. So you're going to have to find ways in which people feel comfortable with dealing with this. So of course, you need the talent, but you're going to need a wider societal understanding of this. Maybe we'll get on to that, about what these things are and what they will do, because otherwise the politics of this will get very, very difficult, I think.
Yeah. So basically, I think the 2 points you're mentioning is one, from a UK standpoint, or even countries broadly in the global north that are not necessarily the US today, that are already attracting a lot of talent. You're saying one, maybe better rules and policies for attracting the best talent wherever that's being generated across the world. And second is education.
I think what I'm saying is actually we do attract the talent. What I think you're going to have to do is more and more shared research. That I think will only grow. We do it with India actually, and we'll do a lot more with it. I suspect India will become a sort of desired research partner for a lot of countries and academic institutions in this area.
Yeah, and so now coming on to the labor market piece. So I was recently in a conversation with MIT economist Darren Acemoglu, who's the author of a book called How Nations Fail and more recently Power and Progress. So on this podcast that I host, we had this conversation about AI, and one of the main implications he spoke about from a societal standpoint of AI was globally, was that we've had a certain model of international distribution of labor over the last 3-4 decades, right? Where obviously countries like India have played a very different role, countries like the US would have played a very different role, UK, etc. And he said that one of the key implications of AI will be that this division of labor internationally and within nations is going to completely turn upside down on its head, right? Especially with geopolitical divisions. So let me ask you this. From a government standpoint or from a country standpoint, right, how do you start to think of this fundamental reorientation of the division of labor globally and also within nations, right? Because AI is also within a nation going to most likely, unless we get it right, create a massive divide amongst talent that is AI enabled, AI literate, and talent that is not, much like the Industrial Revolution, where you see people who get into factories and get into the Industrial Revolution and those that remain behind, and that leads to Ludditism and so on and so forth, right? So how do you see this divide and division of labor playing out on both the country level, within the country, and also globally?
That is an extremely interesting question. That's usually diplomatic speak for I don't know the answer to it.
But now turn on your professor hat or teacher hat.
I think, so firstly, it's partly about basic education, what people are learning. I think when Prime Minister Sunak was here in September and he met some sort of 13 and 14-year-old coders working in the program under the British Council, you know, he was very struck by that, you know, the degree of quality of the education these people had and their interest in it. It's interesting, some of the big Indian investors in the UK are actively involved in education in the UK because they want to grow the talent base in the UK for their companies. So I actually think that companies play quite a useful role in that. Secondly, it's very interesting. So now what you're saying about the who puts the data in, and I actually went recently in Kolkata to a company which has British public capital investment into it, and that is for entering quite a lot of data about, you know, what is a tree, if I'm a car, what's a tree, and stuff like that. To be honest, those are great jobs. I spoke to the employees there. They said, this job, compared to the job we had before, this is fantastic. You know, it's getting better paid. We have better hours. We are coming out of informality into formality, into an area where, and these were mainly women. They were mainly Muslim women from communities in the south of Calcutta. So, yes, there are risks to it. It's interesting how you describe it, because you're right. On the other hand, they thought these were really excellent jobs. I think a lot of it would be very interesting to see. I'm flying after this. I have to be prompted to talk to the Great Festival of Great Indian Learning. Why they should have invited me is a good question, but anyway, they have. And I do think that what schools teach will have to change. You need fundamentals, but you're going to need it. But I think it's very easy to look at schools. I actually think in a country like mine, you're going to have to look at the over 50s as well. Because participation in the labour force is going on for longer. You're actually going to have more people like me are going to have to understand better these things than I think we would naturally think of doing.
Yeah, so let me dig deeper on that education point, and Sneha, bring you back in. You obviously mentioned in your earlier remarks that skilling and education of the youth is very important, clearly. I think Ambassador Ellis has emphasized that even further. Question to you is, do you find that in countries in the global north as well as in the global south, you sit in the US, so even from that perspective, but also from the perspective of countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, do you think that realization that the education has to really start to transform, has that kicked in? Because for most things in the past, whenever you say that you need to have more educational skills in a certain technology or certain things, these things just keep getting talked about. Yeah. But the education systems remain, you know, famously resistant to any kind of change. And so what's your sense whether, one, that change has started, and second, if it's not being done enough, or whether that's not sort of mobilized enough, what can be done to mobilize that quickly enough? Because obviously these are very fundamental issues of, you know, the labor market that will come back to bite countries and governments when it comes to domestic issues.
Yeah, I think that change has started somewhat. I think it started in the global north specifically, but I think that as with a lot of these conversations, the diffusion to the global south will take some time. I think that in the US, I've begun to see some changes to education systems to kind of cultivate AI literacy, and I think that there have been a lot of conversations around, now that students are using ChatGPT in the classroom, how should educators respond? How should we put in place policies to ensure that there are standards for academic integrity, and you also alluded to that in your opening remarks. And so I think that conversation is kicked off in the West, but I think that, I've yet to see that really take place and take hold to the same extent here in the global South. And I think that there is a fundamental reason for that, which is that those feel like later stage concerns when so many economies in the global South are still grappling with more immediate issues
problems
around electrification, around broadband access, around ensuring that we're able to close the digital divide and ensure digital equity. I think those feel like more immediate concerns, and I think that digital skills education, that feels more abstract, that feels like a later stage concern. And so I think that it's really important for us to recognize that even as we're talking about AI literacy and digital skills education, there are so many more immediate challenges that global South economies are still grappling with that we've kind of already skipped past in global North discourse. And I think that kind of remembering that and recontextualizing that will be really, really important. And so I think that you asked the question also of how can we accelerate that and how can we ensure that global South countries are entering that conversation the same way that countries in the global North are. Well, I think that it will require a lot of that multilateral conversation that you were talking about earlier. And I think that as we're having these global bodies convene, I know, for example, the United Nations just convened its multi-stakeholder body to discuss artificial intelligence. Obviously, there was the UK Global AI Safety Summit focused specifically on frontier AI models. But as we are convening these bodies, as we are convening these multilateral consultations and summits, we have to include education as a key pillar of those conversations and also bring countries from the global South to the table. And I think that, again, I mentioned earlier that Kenya has an excellent blueprint for this that I hope will be adopted by many other countries around the world. I bring that up to kind of make the case that there is some progress being made. There is some example to look to, and I think that Kenya has offered that. So to the extent that we can really encourage, more models like that to be adopted around the world, I think that we can really make some strides forward.
No, great. And Alison, if I can bring you onto a very related question, right? So from your perspective, so one is obviously, as Sneha mentioned, there should be more multilateral conversation, and education and skilling must be a key element of that. But while that's going on, right, at the UN and other multilateral conversations, like even GPI, what's your sense on the ground, right? What kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives can be taken up by governments, by non-profit organizations, by private sector organizations on the ground to make sure that this AI education and skilling piece doesn't end up getting, put on the back burner, right? Especially for countries in Africa, whereas, as I think Sneha was mentioning, there are lots of other infrastructural challenges, other socio-political challenges. How do we make sure that multiple stakeholders work together on the ground to make sure that this doesn't get deprioritized?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can focus first, I think, on the role of civil society in that conversation. So actually, the organization that I lead, ENCODE Justice, we are a youth movement working to bring attention to these issues. And in addition to having this, national and international team working on policy and advocacy work, we also have a global chapter network actually working on the ground to start conversations about AI. And so I was, very excited to see that you were on the panel, Honorable Minister, because we have an awesome and well-established Tanzania chapter that actually has been working to lead workshops for youth in Tanzanian schools with curricula that we've developed to, first off, contextualize the use of AI in Tanzania, cite local examples, bring those local use cases to light, but also talk more broadly about the importance of AI literacy in this increasingly globalized economy. And so I think that to the extent that civil society organizations can work to deliver those sorts of workshops and that sort of curriculum on the ground, directly partnering with schools, and to the extent that governments can support that kind of work, again, as those larger scale international and multilateral conversations are unfolding, I think that those sorts of partnerships between civil society and government will be really important. I think that educators around the world have to also take part in this, and I'm super excited to hear that I think there are strides being made in that regard across Africa. And so I think that schools will have to take part in this, civil society will have to take part in this, local governments will have to take part in this, and again, that will all be a supplement to these larger multilateral conversations. But the on-the-ground work is honestly just as important as all of the work that's taking place, all of these hurried negotiations on an international level. Yeah,
absolutely. Alison, can I bring you on that same question as well? And what are you seeing on the ground, and what do you think needs to be changed?
Sure. If I could answer that by just responding also to some of the points that were made here. I mean, I firstly just want to say, you know, education, from all the evidence we do large-scale nationally representative surveys of household, individual, and micro-enterprise use of digital services now, everything through to platform work. And by the way, on the platform work side, because the internet penetration is so low, there's a tiny, tiny incidence. I mean, in many cases, Rwanda, etc., we can't even use the data because we don't have enough statistical points on it. But when you combine this data together, and I should say these are some of the countries that are held up, you know, already got AI blueprints and that, but actually we've only got 15% of people with access to the internet.
15.
In there. 15, not 50. So
and that's the average, so...
And that's common in many of the least developed countries have less than the sort of 20% critical mass that you need to have impacts on, positive impacts on GDP, etc. So the issue, of course, also is that a lot of the donor funding, the state funding that used to go into collecting these basic indicators is now all diverted towards AI, and you can't actually get funding for this ongoing work. We do get some, but a lot of that has been cut and put into AI, which we're also beneficiaries of, so I shouldn't criticize it too much. But I wanted to just return to some of the points, but just to emphasize that education is actually fundamental. The primary determinant of whether you have access to a smartphone device and whether you're able to use the internet is level of education. The more education they have, the more you're able to do with it. So, you know, and that's going to affect the ability to use AI defensively, you know, as a end user, or be able to use it, you know, productively to contribute to the wealth of your nation or something like that. So education is absolutely critical. What we need to be careful of is that we've got foundational educational problems across Africa, numeracy and literacy problems. And, you know, we have one big world summit and everybody wants to introduce coding to the, you know, curriculum, and the teachers are really struggling to even, you know, teach basic numeracy and things like that. And people are teaching coding with no computers or connectivity to the schools, and that. So this is very problematic. Just to link these factors together, just, you know, to go back to the point of data and the biases in the data and the things. Obviously, with these very low levels of internet, you're absolutely correct. In Africa, we're completely invisible. Large numbers of us, not me. Other people in Africa are invisible in these on these sites, and so the use of the utility of them for our data is the thing. But I think it's still important that there are large numbers and they're growing, that we have the kind of equitable access that, you know, American universities, research universities have to that data, that the EU now have through the Digital Services Act. So through state intervention, you know, states' intervention, there's actually access to that data. There's extremely inequitable access to data. And as it currently stands, we would again, as African researchers, have to partner with the EU or Euro or thing to access that data. So I think that's the importance of that access is, data access is very important. But I also want to say there are initiatives on the continent. We have a really, you know, progressive African Union data policy framework now that was passed by 53 member states last year. It's a guiding document, which means we could move much more quickly on it than we did on the Malabo Convention and various things. It's a progressive document, and it's mainly a document on redress. It acknowledges the digital disparities that are there and sets in motion, you know, ways to do that are now in the implementation phase through supportive funding through the European Union and through GIZ. But the important part of that document is that it acknowledges that there is large amounts of data creation on the continent, but about 75% of that data is going off the continent. And so we need to create frameworks that allow us to get that value creation on the continent. And one of the big aspects of that is around public value creation. So unlike India, we might not be creating as much of that data, you know, through social networking or crowdsourcing and that kind of thing. But the public data on the continent is the biggest source of data outside the big tech.
And can I ask you, this public data is currently the domain of big tech firms?
No. So sorry, I'm using public
or
data in the sense of the public sector data.
Public sector,
Yeah,
so
sorry.
data residing
Yeah.
within governments.
Yes. But I think what we speak about very strongly in the African Data Policy Framework is about value creation on the continent. And of course, we do want commercial value creation, but that's kind of been the default. We can also, because we're sitting on these enormous government bodies of data, we can really build public value with that data, taking us back to the questions of digital public infrastructures and the governance of these digital public goods at the national level. And I think there's a very strong framework there to allow for that. And as I said, leveraging opportunities like the African Continental Free Trade Area and things like that, where we absolutely have to have the data underpinnings for those cross flows of information and data across the continent. So there are mechanisms in place, but there's still constraints on those. The implementation at the national level, as we've spoken about, enormous, capabilities of states to set up those frameworks. And the point of the framework is that it provides a guidance and then provides support and implementation to do so. But it still requires institutional capacity on the ground, and there's going to be an enormous need to develop that. So I think there are a number of these things. There are a number of opportunities that are offered. But I must just say that from that platform work, besides the lowest incidence, about 30% of people who were doing platform work were no longer doing platform work because they landed up not being paid, or they were pushed off platforms or various things like that. Some of that may be because they didn't fulfill the work properly, but it's a very high incidence of people who simply weren't paid or were not paid adequately or swiftly.
Yeah.
The other interesting side of that in Africa is that we originally started speaking about this work as micro work, but in fact it's really platform-generated manual work. So the bulk of that work, about 90% of so-called platform work, is actually e-hailing, domestic work, other manual work. And it's, although it is an opportunity for people, and very often in focus groups, if you say to them, shouldn't this be regulated or something, they'll say, we want better terms and conditions from the platform, but we don't want government to regulate this because they might kind of push us off the platform.
Yeah.
But people are not even getting sort of basic 10 ILO rights. It's highly exploitative. And just to speak very quickly on the issue of people who are checking whether things are stairs and robots is one thing, but actually the content regulation work that is being done is horrific. And we actually have Daniel Matuung, who was the whistleblower on Meta's real sweatshops, people with enormous trauma from looking at those horrendous images in order to make it safer for the rest of us. And those kind of working conditions absolutely require regulation. I mean, they just need basic compliance, health and safety compliance.
Yeah. Honorable MP, Ms. Lugungira, if I can bring you back in. So clearly, I think as Alison has pointed out, as Sneha has pointed out, Ambassador Ellis pointed out, Kalika pointed out, right? Now there are various challenges across that AI stack in a way that the Global South needs to overcome. It's not easy, as Alison, you've detailed out. You mentioned earlier that the African Union is also thinking of at a continent level, a regional AI strategy that needs to translate down to the national level. Hopefully through the work of MPs like you, also incorporate bottoms-up perspectives of, let's say, people looking for jobs within your constituency, etc. So tell us a little bit of what that emerging sense of that, African AI strategy could look like, what a particular national strategy for a country like Tanzania could look like, and how that will start to overcome some of these significant obstacles that seem to be there in place. Especially because I'll tell you from a tech venture capital standpoint, I see that every nation, in fact, I wrote a book called The Great Tech Game, where one of the key conclusions of that book was that this is a global competitive game now in technology, AI being one example, where each country needs a game plan. Each country needs to figure out what its specific niche or space in that global ecosystem will be, right? So from that competitive standpoint as well, and from a social standpoint, what are some of the key pillars of that emerging AI strategy, you think, in Africa and in Tanzania?
Thank you very much. I think over the years we've seen that in many sectoral areas, Global South tends to play catch up.
Yes.
But for once, I think with the artificial intelligence, there is that kind of unique window whereby the gap in which you play catch up can be shortened. Now, I wish to also commend the Africa Union ministerial meeting that happened, I think it was 21st November or something like that, where they discussed the issue about the Africa AI strategy. And in collaboration with OECD, I think there's a meeting planned for March next year. The dates, I'm not sure of the dates. I don't think if the dates have been set or not. To kind of discuss now the Africa Union AI strategy. Now coming back, from a continental perspective, it has to go down also country-wise. So if I take, for example, the case of Tanzania, we have recently passed the Data Protection Act. And one of the things that I'm already keen at looking is to try and see, to look at the EU AI Act, for example, and do a comparison on how is the Data Protection Act at the moment protecting us on some of the issues that have been raised in the AI Act, and what are the sort of gaps there. So then as a member of parliament, in collaboration with, civil society, academia, to try and see what can be recommended to beef up the Data Protection Act. That's number one. But number two, in order to have a national AI strategy, I think it's important also for countries to get the necessary support and the necessary capacity building on that artificial intelligence, because there's a number of sectors there. There's agriculture, there's health, issues of food security, water, even natural disaster forecasts.
That's right.
And management. So what area do you focus on, or what can you focus on? Different areas need different capabilities.
That's right.
Which then brings me back to the earlier point of making sure on these global AI frameworks, platforms, can we have more of our countries on board? Represented, because I'm sure that these are some of the capacities that are part and parcel of such platforms. So by having our countries be on board, it means that they can apply and be given such support to build their capacities, to have the relevant strategies that have to be obviously domesticated, but relevant as per the country context. It can't be a copy-paste approach.
Correct. And it has to be contextualized to the specific problems and solutions needed. So I'm going to ask this one last question of our panelists, and then I'm going to take a couple of questions if there are any in the audience. So please take this time to think up and formulate your questions. But so one last question, which was the last theme I'd outlined in the very beginning, which is what role can India play in helping bridge this global south and global north divide? So I'm just going to go across the table and ask everyone for a point or two on this. Some of the pieces that obviously we can touch upon, just to give you guys some ideas, or at least how India is also thinking about, is there an opportunity to scale up the India stack, the DPI that India has been working on, to the rest of the global south? Are there possibilities for cross-country capacity building, right? Opportunities, joint research. Is there a way that India can help bring that voice onto more multilateral platforms, et cetera, et cetera? But if I'm going to start with Kalika, you, and then we'll just go down the table, things that India can help do in bridging this.
So I actually think I'm going to talk about like a micro level thing. These are like at the higher level things. So I think India is actually many Indias, right? We have a very diverse population in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of education, in terms of languages, etc., etc. So India, I think, is really well placed to create value for a very diverse population. And the minute you start doing that, you can actually translate into the diverse population that exists across the global south.
Sure.
So I think that's my view.
Ambassador Ellis, you've already mentioned obviously talent generation and sort of provision to the world, but beyond that, what role do you see for India in this AI?
Certainly voice in kind of all the major global institutions which we're thinking about this. Secondly, example, and also whether that example can translate into other parts of the world. India is very good at frugal innovation. We work with India actually quite a lot in some other countries about how you apply that in the right context. And they are some very effective companies, no doubt about that. I think Indian companies will have a big role to play in this. Finally, just to say, the UK and India have been doing this together for quite a long time. So some of the work we do on, for example, with the Manrega, have I said that right? Manrega?
Manrega,
we have we actually have worked with using AI on anticipation of natural disasters in a way which allows Manrega to be applied more effectively at a local level. We do it on some drug discovery stuff as well with India. So I think also in AI, you have to remember, quite a lot of versions of AI have been around for quite a long time.
That's right.
I think, but I would say voice, example, and businesses. And you're going to excuse me, I have to.
You have to run, that's right. No, but great, thank you so much for being here with us. And hope we didn't ask you too difficult questions. Though obviously as a diplomat and as a teacher, I don't think anything can stump you. And nothing can stump you that easily. Ms. Lugangira, if I can bring you in, like the role of India in helping bridge this global north, global south divide, according to you.
First of all, I am honestly pretty excited that India is coming in as the chair for the global
For
partnership
GPI, that's right.
on artificial intelligence. And going back to the speech of the Honorable Prime Minister during the opening and the speech of the Secretary of the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, I can already see the unique potential that is there through the chairmanship of India, because India has already expressed that it wants to see more countries coming on board. And I think that the relationship that India has with many of our countries, that will also become very beneficial and crucial in the sense that we can relate with each other. And there's that sort of rapport that we're kind of coming from the kind of same level and kind of same situations across our different countries. So to me, it's a very exciting time, and more so with the fact that even the fact that as a member of parliament I'm here already goes to show that how committed the government of India is towards making sure that this artificial intelligence process will be inclusive. So I'm looking forward to working very closely with India, the respective ministries, through the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance, to see how can we also play a role into making sure more of our countries become part of the GPAI.
Yeah, and as Kalika mentioned, I think the diverse population that exists within India, you'll find that there's a lot of similar situations and circumstances that people here are in, along with your countries, so that there is actually real innovation that can happen grounds up as well. Sneha, and then Alison, if I can bring you in on that question.
Yeah, so I think that given that AI development is completely borderless now, there will need to be international coordination on some basic rules of the road for AI. And I think that India, given its position as a country with positive relations with so many other countries, given the fact that it's a global south country that also obviously has so much AI talent and is really growing in that regard, given the fact that it's incredibly diverse, I think it's in a unique position to really lead those international coordination efforts. And so I'm excited to see how that unfolds.
Alison?
Thank you so much. So as a GPA expert and working in this area, it's very exciting to see India's presidency, because as you say, I think we've already seen the commitment to greater inclusion from the Global South, and so certainly we're hoping to see more experts there. But I do think there is a kind of strategic opportunity at the moment, which we're kind of in the middle of, and we probably haven't made enough of, and that is the Troika leadership of the G20 by India, Brazil, and South Africa.
Yes.
That, I think the legacy of digital public infrastructures is there, and India's bequeathed that to the G20 process, and certainly beyond the Global South, it's getting a lot of traction. I think during the time even of the Indian presidency, AI has already kind of exponentially new things have come up that require the kind of global governance leadership and amplify the issues of Global South inclusion. But I really think we can, the AI part of an integrated digital agenda for the G20 over the next 3 years, well, including this year that's passed with India, is a really great opportunity to get those voices heard that we were speaking about, get those resources to the right places, and redress some of the inequalities and injustices that we've seen so far.
So I heard quite a few different elements ranging from, I think, different use cases, different innovations grounds up, talent exchange, right, that India can help lead, joint research. I think joint research doesn't have to just be US, UK with India, but really India with Africa, India with other parts of the Global South. I think education, skilling, right, and then of course voice and representation on multilateral forums. So there's quite a lot that I think India can use this year's presidency of GPAI to also push forward. Are there any questions in the audience? That we have just a few minutes, but we'll take a couple. Keep your question brief and introduce yourself very briefly, and let me know if you're directing it to any one particular or the panel.
Okay, good evening everyone. My name is Lakshmi Sai Kumar, and I work on a think tank called Global Economic Impact Forum, and currently I'm working on ed tech company called Part-Timer Inc. So my question is pretty simple and straightforward. What are the entry barriers if I'm an Indian company to enter into African, as an ed
To
tech?
enter into African markets?
Yeah, so with AI coming into...
You have an ed tech company?
Yes.
Well, we'll give it to Ms.
I mean, like,
Lagungira. She's
considering,
probably
like,
best.
there is a digital divide, there is rural and...
Have you
urban.
already tried?
Not yet. I'm looking at it.
So what are
What are
might
the
be the key
barriers of
obstacles
entry
or barriers
for an
for an
Indian
Indian
company?
ed tech company to enter into
Of course, technology
African
makes
markets?
it bridges a gap, but considering digital divide. Thank you.
I think they will, most African countries, including Tanzania, are very much welcoming, companies, private sector to come into this space, especially because by them coming on board, it opens up door of capacity building of the local employment, etc. The one barrier that I can think of is obviously if a company doesn't want to adhere to the requirements and the legislations of the country, then that can be a barrier. But that's what I can say.
Yeah, and I can add one more thing. So if you look at the last 5 to 7 years from the Indian startup ecosystem standpoint, you'll find a lot of Indian entrepreneurs, a lot of Indian startups, a lot of Indian venture capital funds have ventured beyond India to help support entrepreneurs in the Southeast Asian market, the Middle East market. There's lots and lots of now early stage African VC funds as well. And you'll find that you'll get the capital and innovation sort of risk capital support also. And clearly you have her word and it's recorded to
it is a fact because one of the things that our president has done, Our Excellency President Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan has done is to open up Tanzania and to welcome foreign investment into the country. So if there is someone who is serious about doing so, I think they're welcome, and the government is continuously creating that enabling environment for foreign investment to thrive in the country. However, I reaffirm that you must adhere to the laws and the regulations of the respective country, irrespective of where you're coming from or how much money you're bringing into the country. Thank you.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I'm going to, sorry, in the interest of time, I'm going to take a second question.
I just want to add on.
One minute. If I don't,
please.
if I might.
Thank you so much.
A couple more questions. And then, of course, you can talk to us offline.
I'm not asking a question like...
go ahead.
Let me come. Thank you so much. So as you said...
Can you give the mic here?
Just 1 second, please. So, we are looking for collaboration with educational institutions, be it universities in Tanzania, if that, we want to enter the market through those educational institutions.
I think that point is taken.
Like what I said already, every government has a system of how you engage. So if you want to engage with the education sector, we have the Ministry of Education. But again, we have to do everything according to the laws and the requirements of the respective country. No shortcuts.
Correct.
Thank you.
If I may, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I'm a third-year student. I'm pursuing my engineering in AI and ML. So as a student and being the youth of the country, being representative of it, you mentioned...
Keep the mic close to you.
Okay. So you mentioned the term as actualization of potential, right?
Yes.
So to be really honest, it's a suggestion, more of a question, that the resources are accessible only to the privileged. I would say 90% of Indian students have a lack of mentorship. Like, youth is the actual power of India. And 90% of youth of India are devoid of resources, mentorship, I would say. So, and also these conversations are also localized for the people who have privilege of internet and all the XYZ resources. So I would just say, to actualization of the potential, we need resources, we need mentorship for the students.
I'll very quickly answer this.
Yeah.
First, send me a mail,
okay,
and we can continue the conversation. The second is, I was at an academic conference. The thing is, I agree with the lack of resources, and there should be something done to mitigate that. But I had a very good analogy from Professor Chris Manning from Stanford. He said all aeronautical engineers are not building Boeing planes, right? So if you actually are interested in only building a GPT, ChatGPT, or a Llama, etc., there might be a problem. Even I don't have resources to do that. But there are other things that go into building a Boeing that aeronautical engineers do, right? Form the foundation of building a Boeing, and you can always do that. But I take your point, and I agree that there should be something done for extending mentorship, etc. But for you, you just send me a mail after this.
Sure. Thank
Cool. I think time's really up, but if the organizers permit, I'll take one more question. But I know there's a closing session at. So should we close, or do we have another minute? Okay. So with that, time's up, unfortunately. But I think the panelists will be around for a few minutes post. So for those of you who do have still, we can. Oh, great. So we'll take your question and keep it brief.
Sure. This is Mukul. I'm currently an AI researcher at Vadhvani AI. So my question is, so we are talking about, building global partnerships for AI, but AI is mostly contextual, right? For example, something that we are building in US might not work here, right? So should we focus on building something here that could be useful in the world, or should we focus on more local building AIs? So mostly anyone who can take this. Yeah.
I can take that again. Sorry, I'm not. So I think both is the right answer. Some of the things are generalizable across the board to the entire globe. Some of the things are very contextual. We have to ground some of our AI models and applications to the local context for them to work. And we need people to do both. And that's not a diplomatic answer. I really believe we have to do both.
Correct. Any last questions? Okay,
yes, sir.
So that's our last question.
My name is Sushil from Karnataka. So in this AI summit, my question is, how do you achieve the sustainable developmental goals 17 through AI? Because it is mainly artificial, so it is not 100% right. So we cannot get 100% accuracy in here. So
sustainable development goals are of course very broad. Okay. One is obviously a set of sustainable climate related goals, but you're talking also about poverty, healthcare, other sustainable development goals?
Yes, sir. It's sustainable developmental goal number 9 through innovation and infrastructure.
Correct.
So in this GPay exhibition summit, we have seen the lot of data collection and building that data collection through a software and providing as a services. So it is mainly the security issues. So how can you address these security issues through this summit?
So I'll keep the question broad. Is how can AI help us achieve broadly the SDGs that exist, and also maybe specifically keeping in mind the security concerns that he's highlighted. Alison, maybe you want to take that?
Thank you. So I think you might have been in sessions that are focused on security. Security is a very important part of the work of GPay that's going on. But a number of the different working groups are focusing on different issues. So as was mentioned, there's a big working group on climate change, on climate-induced migration, as we've mentioned, the economic and data justice issues. So there are a number of ones that are also focusing on the contribution that made. In fact, the whole GPI is framed within progress towards the SDGs. And some of those you can track against those specific ones. And of course, the fundamental one is the contribution through innovation and infrastructures to the attainment of the SDGs. But if you go onto the GPay website, you'll see lots of the working groups will actually reference what that contribution will be to whatever SDG they're focusing on.
Okay, sir.
Great. Perfect. Thank you so much. With that, I think we've run out of time. Thank all the panelists here and you all. I know this is the last session on day 3, so thank you for your participation and staying here. And thank you to all our panelists from across different sectors for this conversation.
Thank you.